There are moments in life when we believe we are making the right choice, especially when those we love most ask us to trust them. I was 40 years old when I signed a document that would change everything. At that moment, surrounded by my parents and my brother, I thought I was bringing peace to my family. I thought I was being the good daughter, the one who always puts others first. But what I did not know was that, with a single signature I was giving up much more than I imagined. This is my story of manipulation, loss, and ultimately, the strength I found within myself to rise again. Before we begin this incredible story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're hearing this story from. Your help is very important to us. The afternoon sun filtered through the heavy curtains of my parents' living room, casting long shadows across the Persian rug that had been there since I was a child. I sat on the edge of the leather sofa, my hands trembling slightly as I held the cup of tea my mother had prepared. The porcelain felt cold against my palms, despite the steam rising from the surface. Across from me, my father sat in his usual armchair, his reading glasses perched on his nose, while my mother stood near the window, her arms crossed over her chest. My brother Daniel was leaning against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room was suffocating. We had been arguing for nearly 2 hours, and my head was pounding. The dispute had started weeks ago, after my father mentioned updating his will. What should have been a simple family discussion had turned into something bitter and divisive. Daniel wanted certain assets. I wanted fairness. My parents seemed exhausted by it all. I never imagined that this gathering would end the way it did. When my father cleared his throat and pulled out a folder from the side table, I thought perhaps he was going to show us the updated documents, maybe explain his decisions. Instead, he placed several sheets of paper on the coffee table between us and looked directly at me. His voice was steady, almost too calm. He told me that this conflict was tearing the family apart. He said that my mother had not been sleeping well, that the stress was affecting her health. He gestured toward the papers and explained that they had prepared a document that would settle everything once and for all. If I signed it, he said, the fighting would stop. Peace would return to our family. Everyone would be satisfied. I looked down at the papers. The legal language was dense, difficult to understand at a glance. I asked what exactly I would be signing. My father waved his hand dismissively and said it was simply a formalization of the family agreement, a way to ensure that no one would contest anything in the future. My mother stepped forward then, her face drawn with worry. She placed her hand on my shoulder and told me that this was the only way to move forward. She asked me, almost pleaded, to trust them, to do this. One thing for the family. Daniel said nothing. He just watched me with those dark eyes of his, waiting. I felt cornered, exhausted. The weight of their expectations pressed down on me like a physical force. I had always been the peacemaker in the family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and made sacrifices to keep everyone happy. My own marriage had ended 2 years earlier, partly because I had spent so much time and energy managing my family's dramas instead of focusing on my own life. I was tired of fighting, tired of being the difficult one. All I wanted in that moment was for the tension to end, for my mother to stop looking at me with such disappointment, for my father to stop treating me like I was causing all the problems. So I picked up the pen. My hand shook as I brought it to the paper. I hesitated for just a moment, looking up at my parents one more time, searching their faces for reassurance. My father nodded encouragingly. My mother squeezed my shoulder, and I signed. I signed every page where there was a little tab indicating my signature was needed. I did not read the fine print. I did not ask for time to have a lawyer review it. I simply trusted that my parents would never do anything to hurt me. When I finished, my father collected the papers quickly, sliding them back into the folder. He smiled, a tight smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and thanked me. He said I had done the right thing. My mother hugged me, but it felt perfunctory, as if she were going through the motions. Daniel finally spoke, saying something about how this was better for everyone, and then he left the room without another word. I drove home that evening feeling hollow. Something deep inside me whispered that I had made a terrible mistake, but I pushed the feeling away. I told myself that I had brought peace to my family. That was what mattered. That was what a good daughter did. The following weeks were strange. My parents became distant. Phone calls that used to come regularly became sporadic. When I suggested having dinner together, my mother made excuses about being busy or not feeling well. My father stopped answering my messages altogether. I tried not to take it personally. I told myself they were just dealing with their own stress, that things would return to normal soon. Then Daniel bought a new house. It was a beautiful property in an upscale neighborhood, far more expensive than anything he should have been able to afford on his salary. When I congratulated him and asked how he had managed it, he was vague, mentioning something about investments and good timing, but there was a smugness in his tone that I could not ignore. I started to feel uneasy. The whisper of doubt that I had silenced before began to grow louder. One night, unable to sleep, I pulled out the copy of the document I had been given after signing. I had barely glanced at it before, but now I read through it carefully, trying to decipher the legal terminology. What I found made my blood run cold. The document was not simply a family agreement. It was a formal renunciation of inheritance. By signing it, I had voluntarily given up any claim to my parents' estate. Everything they owned, everything they would leave behind, would go entirely to Daniel. I had signed away my birthright, my financial security, my future, all in the name of keeping the peace. I felt sick. My hands shook as I read through the pages again and again, hoping I had misunderstood, hoping there was some clause or exception that would prove me wrong. But there was none. It was clear and legally binding. I had given up everything. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I had ever experienced. My parents, the people who were supposed to protect me and look out for my best interests, had manipulated me into signing away my inheritance, and they had done it so easily, exploiting my exhaustion and my desperate desire for family harmony. Daniel had known exactly what was happening. He had stood there and watched me sign away my future, and he had said nothing. He had wanted this. Maybe he had even orchestrated it. I called my mother the next morning, my voice shaking with anger and hurt. I told her I had read the document, that I understood what I had signed. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold in a way I had never heard before. She told me that I had made my choice, that I had signed willingly, that it was done now, and there was nothing to discuss. Then she hung up. I tried calling my father. He did not answer. I sent messages. No response. I drove to their house, but they would not open the door. Through the window, I could see my mother turning away, deliberately ignoring my knocking. I stood there on the porch, the same porch, where I had played as a child, and I realized with devastating clarity that I had been discarded, used, and then thrown away. Daniel sent me a single text message that afternoon. It was brief and pointed. He told me that I should have read what I was signing, that this was the real world, and people needed to protect themselves, that he had simply been smart enough to position himself properly. He ended by saying that maybe now I would learn to be less naive. Then he blocked my number. The days that followed were some of the darkest of my life. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of betrayal and regret. How could I have been so foolish? How could I have trusted them so completely? I replayed that afternoon in my parents' living room over and over in my mind, analyzing every word, every gesture, looking for the signs I should have seen. They had been so calculated, so deliberate in their manipulation, and I had walked right into their trap. My friends tried to comfort me, but their sympathy only made me feel worse. I was 40 years old, a grown woman, and I had let myself be played like a child. The shame was almost unbearable. I stopped going out, stopped answering calls. I just sat in my small apartment, staring at the walls, wondering how my life had fallen apart so completely. But beneath the pain and the shame, something else was beginning to stir. It started as a tiny spark of anger, barely noticeable at first, but as the days passed, that spark grew into a flame. I thought about everything I had sacrificed for my family over the years, the opportunities I had passed up, the relationships I had neglected, the dreams I had set aside, all because I had been taught that family came first, and this was how they repaid me. This was what my loyalty and love had earned me. I was not going to let them destroy me. I was not going to crumble and disappear just because they had decided I was disposable. I had signed that document. Yes, I had made a terrible mistake, but I was still here. I was still standing, and I was going to find a way to fight back. Late one night, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and began to write down everything I knew, every detail of that afternoon. Every conversation I could remember from the weeks before, every strange interaction with my parents and Daniel. I wrote down dates, times, specific words that had been said. I was not sure yet what I would do with this information, but I knew I needed to document everything while it was still fresh in my mind. Then I started researching. I looked up laws regarding inheritance, coercion, undue influence, elder manipulation. I read through legal forums and articles, trying to understand if there was any possible way to challenge what had been done. Most of what I found was discouraging. Signed documents were taken seriously by courts. Proving that I had been manipulated would be extremely difficult, especially since I had signed voluntarily, without anyone forcing a pen into my hand. But I also found stories of people who had fought back against family betrayal, people who had found ways to reclaim their dignity and their lives, even when the odds seemed impossible. Those stories gave me hope. They reminded me that I was not alone, that this kind of betrayal happened more often than people realized, and that survival was possible. I made an appointment with a lawyer who specialized in estate disputes. The consultation cost money I could barely afford, but I needed to understand my options. The lawyer was kind but honest. She reviewed the document and confirmed what I already knew. It was legally binding and very difficult to challenge, unless I could prove that I had been under duress, or that I lacked the mental capacity to understand what I was signing, or that there had been fraud involved. The document would likely stand. She asked me questions about the circumstances of the signing. Had anyone threatened me? Had I been drugged or intoxicated? Had I been given time to review the document with independent legal counsel? The answer to all these questions was no. I had simply been emotionally exhausted and trusting. That, she explained gently, was not enough for a court to invalidate my signature. But then she said something that stayed with me. She told me that legal battles were not the only way to reclaim power. Sometimes, she said, the best revenge was simply living well, building a life so successful and fulfilling that those who had wronged you would have to watch you thrive without them. It was not the answer I had been hoping for, but there was wisdom in her words. I left her office feeling strangely calm. The panic and desperation that had consumed me for weeks began to settle into something colder and more focused. I could not undo what had been done. I could not force my parents to love me or Daniel to have a conscience, but I could decide how I responded. I could choose to let this destroy me, or I could choose to rebuild. Capítulo 2. I had not always been the woman who could be so easily manipulated. There was a time when I had been confident, even bold. To understand how I ended up signing away my inheritance in my parents' living room, I need to go back to the beginning. Need to explain how the dynamics in my family were built, brick by brick, over decades. How I was shaped into the person who would always sacrifice herself for the sake of peace. Growing up, our house in the suburbs of Philadelphia was picture perfect from the outside. White fence, manicured lawn, flowers blooming in neat rows along the walkway. My father worked as an accountant for a large firm, and my mother stayed home to raise us. Daniel was 3 years older than me, and from the moment I was born, it was clear that he was the golden child. I do not think my parents set out to favor him deliberately. It just happened naturally, the way these things often do. Daniel was their firstborn, their son, the one who would carry on the family name. He was athletic and charismatic, always surrounded by friends, always excelling at whatever he tried. Teachers loved him. Coaches praised him. Other parents pointed to him as an example for their own children. I was quieter, more sensitive. I liked reading and drawing, spending hours in my room creating imaginary worlds. My grades were good, sometimes even better than Daniel's, but somehow my achievements never generated the same excitement. When Daniel brought home a report card with mostly A's and a few B's, there would be celebration. When I brought home straight A's, there would be a quick nod of approval, and then the conversation would move on to something else. I learned early on that my role in the family was to be easy, to not cause problems, to support Daniel and make my parents proud by being the good girl who never complained. And for a long time, I accepted that role without question. I thought that was just how families worked. Some children were meant to shine, and others were meant to provide the support that made that shine possible. When I was 12, something happened that should have been a warning sign, but I was too young to understand it at the time. My grandmother, my father's mother, passed away and left behind a modest estate. In her will, she had specified that certain items were to go to specific grandchildren. Daniel was to receive her antique desk, a beautiful piece of furniture that had been in the family for generations. I was to receive her collection of first edition books, which she knew I treasured. But when the estate was being settled, my father decided that the books should actually go to Daniel as well. He reasoned that Daniel was older and would appreciate them more, that he would take better care of them. I remember crying in my room, feeling like something precious had been stolen from me. My mother came in and sat on my bed. She stroked my hair and told me that sometimes we had to make sacrifices for family harmony. She said that Daniel really wanted those books, and it would mean so much to him. She asked me to be the bigger person and let him have them. So I did. I swallowed my disappointment and told everyone it was fine. Daniel got the books and the desk. I got nothing except the reputation of being mature and understanding. That pattern would repeat itself many times over the years. In high school, I excelled in art and English. My paintings won awards in local competitions. I had 2 poems published in a regional literary magazine. I thought maybe, finally, I was carving out my own space where I could be recognized and valued. But my parents rarely attended my art shows. They were always busy with Daniel's football games or track meets. When I tried to show my mother my published poems, she glanced at them briefly and said they were nice, but then immediately started talking about Daniel's latest athletic scholarship offer. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself I was being selfish for wanting more attention. After all, Daniel's athletic career could lead to a college scholarship, which would help the family financially. My art was just a hobby. That was what my father said when I suggested applying to art schools. He told me to be practical, to choose a stable career path. So I went to a state university and majored in business administration, even though it bored me to tears. Daniel did get his scholarship, a full ride to a prestigious university. The day he left for college, my parents threw a big party. Friends and relatives came to celebrate. There were speeches and toasts and cake. 2 years later, when I left for my own university, there was a quiet dinner and a check to help with my first semester's expenses. No party, no celebration, just a reminder to study hard and make them proud. College was supposed to be my chance to become my own person, but I found myself still tethered to my family's expectations. I called home every week. I came back for every holiday and break. I sent my parents care packages and remembered every birthday and anniversary. Daniel, meanwhile, barely stayed in touch. He was busy with his life, his friends, his ambitions, but somehow, his distance was seen as independence and maturity, while my attentiveness was just expected. After graduation, I got a job at a marketing firm. It was not what I had dreamed of, but it was stable and it paid reasonably well. I rented a small apartment and tried to build a life for myself. Around that time, I met Thomas. He was kind and steady, an engineer who worked for a construction company. We dated for 2 years before getting married in a modest ceremony. My parents seemed pleased enough, though I could not help but notice that they spent more on Daniel's graduation party than they contributed to my wedding. Thomas and I settled into married life. We talked about buying a house, having children, building a future together. But there was always something getting in the way. My parents needed help with something. Daniel was going through a difficult time and needed support. There was always some family crisis that required my attention and energy. Thomas began to resent it. He pointed out that I was always available for my family, but often too exhausted to invest in our own relationship. He said I let them walk all over me, that I needed to set boundaries. I knew. He was right, but I did not know how to change. The patterns had been set for so long. Being the good daughter, the one who sacrificed and accommodated, was the only way I knew how to exist in my family. When Daniel got married, it was a grand affair. My parents spared no expense. The wedding was held at an elegant venue, with hundreds of guests, a live band, elaborate decorations. I was happy for him, genuinely, but I could not help feeling a pang of hurt when I compared his wedding to my own simple ceremony. My mother noticed me looking at the floral arrangements and commented that they had been able to do more for Daniel because they were in a better financial position now, but I knew that was not entirely true. They had simply prioritized him, as they always had. Daniel's wife, Rebecca, came from a wealthy family. Her parents were real estate developers, well-connected and influential. Almost immediately, Daniel's lifestyle changed. He started dressing in expensive clothes, driving luxury cars, attending exclusive events. My parents were thrilled. They bragged to their friends about Daniel's success, about the important people he knew, about the glamorous life he was living. Meanwhile, Thomas and I were struggling. The marketing firm where I worked downsized, and I lost my job. I found freelance work, but it was inconsistent and stressful. Money became tight. Thomas worked long hours to make up the difference, but the strain was taking its toll on our marriage. When I mentioned our difficulties to my parents, hoping perhaps for some emotional support if not financial help, my father suggested I should have chosen a more stable career path. My mother said that marriage required sacrifice and hard work, implying that perhaps I was not trying hard enough. I asked if they might be able to lend us a small amount to help us get through a particularly difficult month. My father refused. He said they needed to be careful with their money, that they were planning for their retirement. But 2 weeks later, I learned that they had given Daniel a substantial sum to invest in one of his business ventures. When I confronted them about it, they said that Daniel had a real opportunity, something that could provide returns. Lending money to us, they implied, would just be throwing it away on our problems. That was when I started to truly see the pattern. It was not just about childhood favoritism or parental pride. It was about how they valued us fundamentally. Daniel was seen as an investment, someone whose success reflected well on them and might benefit them in the future. I was seen as a burden, someone who required support but offered little in return. My accomplishments, such as they were, did not fit the narrative they wanted. I was not wealthy or glamorous or connected. I was just their struggling daughter who had not lived up to her potential. My marriage to Thomas ended when I was 38. We had grown too far apart, and the resentment had built up too high. He said he felt like he was competing with my family for my attention, and he was tired of always coming in second place. I could not argue with him. He was right. We divorced amicably, splitting our minimal assets and going our separate ways. It was sad, but also, in a strange way, a relief. At least now I did not have to feel guilty about the time and energy I gave to my family. After the separation, I moved into a smaller apartment and tried to rebuild my life yet again. I was nearly 40 hours single, working freelance jobs that barely covered my expenses. I felt like a failure in every possible way, and my family's treatment of me only reinforced that feeling. Phone calls from my parents became shorter and less frequent. Invitations to family gatherings sometimes seemed like afterthoughts. Daniel rarely spoke to me unless he needed something. Then my father's health began to decline. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to make him and my mother start thinking seriously about their legacy. That was when the talk of updating the will began. At first, the conversations were general. My father would mention that they needed to get their affairs in order, that they wanted to make sure everything was clear and fair. I thought, naively, that this might finally be my chance to be seen as an equal in the family, that perhaps they would recognize that I deserved the same consideration as Daniel, despite our different circumstances. But as the weeks went on, it became clear that Daniel had a very specific vision for how the estate should be divided. He argued that since he had been more successful financially, he was better equipped to manage assets. He suggested that splitting everything equally would not actually be fair, because I would probably just squander my share or make poor decisions with it. My parents seemed to listen to him carefully, nodding along with his reasoning. I tried to defend myself. I pointed out that my financial struggles were not due to poor decision-making, but to circumstances largely beyond my control. I had lost my job in a recession. My marriage had ended. I had been dealt a difficult hand, but I had always tried my best. My father listened with a distant expression, then said that life was about results, not effort. That harsh as it might sound, Daniel had proven himself capable while I had not. Those words cut me deeper than anything else he had ever said. I had spent my entire life trying to prove myself worthy of their love and respect. I had sacrificed my dreams, my marriage, my own happiness in service of being the good daughter, and in the end, it meant nothing. I was still the disappointment, the one who had not lived up to expectations. The arguments escalated over the following weeks. Daniel became more aggressive in his position, insisting that the bulk of the estate should go to him. He framed it as being practical and sensible. My mother worried constantly, saying the conflict was making her ill. My father grew increasingly frustrated with what he called my stubbornness. They painted me as the problem, the one causing discord in the family. I felt myself breaking under the pressure. Every conversation left me feeling more drained and worthless. I started having trouble sleeping. I would lie awake at night, replaying arguments in my head, trying to find the right words that would make them see me as I truly was, not as the failure they had decided I was. But those words never came. Looking back now, I can see how they were setting the stage for what would happen. Next, they were breaking me down systematically, making me doubt myself, making me feel like I was the cause of all the family's problems. They were preparing me to accept whatever solution they proposed, no matter how unfair it might be. And I was so desperate for their approval, so exhausted from fighting, that I walked right into their trap. That afternoon in the living room, when my father laid those papers on the table, I was already defeated. I had been worn down to the point where I would do anything to make the conflict stop, to make them stop looking at me with such disappointment and frustration, to prove that I could still be the good daughter, even if I could never be the successful one. So I signed, and in doing so, I gave them exactly what they wanted. I removed myself as an obstacle. I made things simple and clean for Daniel. I sacrificed myself. One final time, hoping against hope that this ultimate act of selflessness would finally earn me the love and respect I had been chasing my entire life. But of course, it did not, because the truth was, nothing I could have done would have been enough. They had decided long ago who I was in their eyes, and no amount of sacrifice or accommodation was going to change that. I was not the golden child. I was not the investment. I was just the convenient daughter who could be counted on to step aside when it mattered. The days after I discovered what I had really signed were a blur of phone calls that went unanswered and messages that were ignored. I drove to my parents' house 3 more times, each time hoping they would open the door and we could talk this through. Each time, I saw the curtains move slightly, saw shadows passing behind the windows, but no one answered. They were home. They simply did not want to see me. Daniel's new house was in a gated community. I tried to visit him there once, but the security guard at the entrance told me I was not on the approved visitor list. When I called Daniel to ask him to add me, he said he would think about it. He never did. His message was clear. I was no longer welcome in his life. I had served my purpose, and now I was an embarrassment, a reminder of the manipulation that had enriched him. Rebecca, his wife, posted photos on social media of their beautiful home, their expensive vacations, their perfect life. In some of the photos, I could see my parents visiting them, smiling and relaxed. They had not cut off all family contact. They had just cut off me. I was the only one left out in the cold. The loneliness was crushing. I had built my entire identity around being a daughter, a sister, a member of this family. And now that identity had been stripped away, I was no one to them, less than a stranger. At least strangers had the possibility of becoming something more. I was a closed chapter, a problem solved, a loose end tied up. But there was also a strange clarity that came with being completely rejected. For the first time in my life, I did not have to worry about pleasing them. I did not have to calculate how my choices would affect their opinion of me. I was free of their expectations, because they no longer had any expectations of me at all. It was a painful kind of freedom, but it was freedom nonetheless. I thought about the lawyer's words. The best revenge is living well. At the time, it had seemed like a consolation prize, something people say when there are no real options left. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. My family had taken my inheritance, but they could not take my ability to build a life. They could not take my skills, my intelligence, my determination. They could not take my future unless I let them. I was 40 years old. I had nothing but a small apartment, some freelance work, and a betrayal that burned in my chest like a fire. But I also had something I had never fully possessed before. I had clarity. I knew exactly who my family was now. I knew what they were capable of, and I knew that I owed them nothing. Not my time, not my energy, not my love, and certainly not my future. I started making plans, small ones at first. I updated my resume and started looking for stable employment. I reached out to old colleagues and re-established professional connections. I began attending networking events, pushing through my discomfort and exhaustion to put myself out there. I could not afford to wallow. I had to survive, and survival meant taking action. Within a month, I landed a contract position at a digital marketing agency. It was not glamorous, but it was steady work with decent pay. I threw myself into the job with an intensity I had not felt in years. I worked late nights and weekends, learning new skills, proving my worth. When the contract ended, they offered me a full-time position. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. I also started going to therapy. I knew I needed help processing the betrayal and understanding how I had allowed myself to be treated so poorly for so long. My therapist helped me see the patterns that had been established in childhood, the ways I had been conditioned to prioritize everyone else's needs over my own. She helped me understand that setting boundaries was not selfish. It was necessary, that I deserved respect and love, not because of what I could do for others, but simply because I existed. Slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild my sense of self. I started saying no to things I did not want to do. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I let myself feel angry about what had been done to me, instead of pushing the anger down and pretending everything was fine. It was hard work, maybe the hardest thing I had ever done. But it was also necessary. 6 months had passed since I signed away my inheritance. 6 months of silence from my family. 6 months of rebuilding my life, one painful step at a time. I had started to find a rhythm in my new reality. The marketing agency where I worked full-time had promoted me to senior project manager. My apartment, though small, had become a sanctuary rather than a prison. I was learning to live with the anger and the grief, carrying them like stones in my pockets that grew lighter with each passing day. But then everything shifted again. It started with a phone call from a number I did not recognize. I almost did not answer, thinking it was a sales call or a scam, but something made me pick up. On the other line was a woman named Patricia, who introduced herself as my father's former secretary from his accounting firm. She had retired 3 years earlier, but had stayed in touch with some of her old colleagues. Patricia's voice was hesitant, almost apologetic. She told me she had been debating whether to call me for weeks. She knew it was not really her business, but her conscience would not let her stay silent. She had heard things, she said, conversations that troubled her deeply. She paused, and I could hear her taking a deep breath before continuing. She told me that about 8 months ago, before the whole conflict about the will had even begun, Daniel had come to visit our father at his office. Patricia had not been there, but her replacement, a young woman named Jennifer, had mentioned it later. Jennifer said Daniel had spent several hours behind closed doors with our father, going over documents and having what seemed like very serious discussions. Over the following weeks, Daniel had returned multiple times, always with folders and papers, always looking pleased when he left. Patricia said she would not have thought much of it, except that Jennifer had accidentally overheard part of one conversation when she brought coffee into the office. She heard Daniel telling our father that the key was to make it seem like it was my idea, or at least that I was willing, that if they pushed too hard or too obviously, there might be legal problems later. But if I signed voluntarily, believing it was for the good of the family, then everything would be clean and permanent. My hands began to shake as I held the phone. Patricia continued, her voice heavy with regret. She said she only learned about all this recently when she met Jennifer for coffee. Jennifer had been troubled by what she overheard and needed to talk to someone about it. Patricia, knowing the family, immediately understood the implications. She asked around discreetly and learned that I had indeed signed some kind of document and that I was no longer in contact with my parents or brother. Patricia told me she was calling because she felt I deserved to know the truth, that what had happened to me was not just unfortunate or the result of family dysfunction. It was calculated. It was planned. Daniel had orchestrated the entire thing, and my parents had gone along with it willingly. The arguments, the pressure, the emotional manipulation, it had all been part of a deliberate strategy to get me to sign away my rights. After I hung up, I sat in stunned silence for a long time. I had known, on some level, that I had been manipulated, but hearing that it had been planned months in advance, that Daniel had actually strategized about how to trick me, brought the betrayal to a whole new level. This was not just favoritism or poor judgment. This was calculated cruelty. This was theft, dressed up as family harmony. The anger I had been managing so carefully erupted like a volcano. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break things. I wanted to drive to Daniel's perfect house in his gated community and tell him exactly what I thought of him. But I forced myself to sit still and think. Acting on rage would only make things worse. I needed to be smart. I needed to use this information strategically. I called the lawyer I had consulted months earlier and told her what I had learned. She listened carefully, asking detailed questions about Patricia, about what exactly had been overheard, about whether there was any way to document or verify the information. I could hear the shift in her tone. She was interested now in a way she had not been before. She explained that if we could prove Daniel had engaged in fraud or undue influence, if we could show that there had been a conspiracy to deceive me into signing the document, then we might have grounds to challenge it after all. The problem was evidence. Hearsay from a former secretary about a conversation overheard by someone else would not be enough. We needed something concrete. Documents, recordings, emails, something that proved the conspiracy existed. I thought about this for days. I did not have access to my father's office or his files. I certainly had no way to get into Daniel's records. But then I remembered something. My mother kept everything. Every card, every letter, every piece of family correspondence going back decades. She had boxes and boxes of papers in the basement of my parents' house, organized meticulously by year and category. If there was any written communication between Daniel and my parents about their plan, it might be there. But how could I get access? They would not let me in the house. They had made that abundantly clear. I thought about breaking in, but that was absurd and illegal. I thought about hiring someone to do it, but that seemed even worse. I was stuck. Then I had an idea. My parents went to the same church every Sunday morning. Like clockwork. They had done so for as long as I could remember. The service started at 10, and usually ran until 11:30, sometimes longer if there were special events afterward. That would give me at least 90 minutes, maybe more, and I still had my key to their house. They had never asked for it back, probably because it had never occurred to them that I would dare to use it without permission. The plan was risky. If they, came home early and found me there, it would be ugly. They might call the police. I could be arrested for trespassing or breaking and entering, even though I had a key. But I was desperate. I needed evidence, and this might be my only chance to get it. The following Sunday, I woke up early and drove to my parents' neighborhood. I parked a few streets away, not wanting my car to be visible from their house. At 9:45, I watched from a distance as they left for church, my father driving their sedan with my mother in the passenger seat. As soon as they turned the corner and disappeared from view, I walked quickly to the house. My heart was pounding as I slid the key into the lock. For a moment, I thought maybe they had changed the locks, that the key would not work, but it turned smoothly, and the door opened. I stepped inside, into the house where I had grown up and felt like a criminal in my own childhood home. Everything looked the same. The furniture, the photographs on the walls, the smell of my mother's favorite candles, but it all felt alien now, like a museum dedicated to a family that no longer existed. I did not let myself get distracted by nostalgia or emotion. I had a job to do and limited time to do it. I went straight to the basement. The stairs creaked in the same places they always had. The basement was finished, with wood paneling and carpeted floors, and one entire wall was lined with shelves holding plastic storage boxes, each labeled in my mother's neat handwriting. I scanned the labels quickly: financial documents, tax returns, insurance policies, correspondence. I pulled down the box labeled correspondence and started going through it. There were letters from relatives, holiday cards, notes from friends. I went through each piece of paper carefully, looking for anything that might be relevant. Then, near the bottom of the box, I found a folder labeled Family Matters. Inside were several printed emails. My hands trembled as I began to read. The first email was from Daniel to my father, dated 9 months earlier. In it, Daniel laid out his concerns about the estate being split equally. He wrote that he had worked hard to build his success, and that it would not be fair for me to receive the same amount when I had not achieved the same level of financial stability. He suggested that they needed to find a way to adjust the distribution without causing a major conflict. The next email was my father's response. He agreed with Daniel's assessment but expressed concern about how to approach the situation. He wrote that I could be stubborn when I felt I was being treated unfairly, and that simply telling me I would receive less might lead to a long legal battle that would cost everyone time and money. Then came the most damning email. It was from Daniel, responding to my father's concerns. In it, he outlined a strategy. He wrote that the key was to create a situation where I would feel like signing away my inheritance was my own choice, made for the good of the family. He suggested that they should start having arguments about the will, make the conflict seem unbearable, and then present a document as the solution to restore peace. He wrote that I was always the peacemaker, always willing to sacrifice for family harmony, and that they could use that trait to their advantage. He even wrote, and I will never forget these words, that if they played it right, I would probably sign without even reading the document carefully. He said I trusted them too much, and that trust could be exploited. He ended the email by saying that once I signed, it would be legally binding, and I would have no recourse. The inheritance would be secured for him, and I would be out of the picture permanently. I felt physically ill as I read those words. Seeing the manipulation spelled out so clearly, so coldly, was worse than I had imagined. This was not a matter of favoritism or poor judgment. This was predatory. This was my own brother, strategizing about how to steal from me, how to exploit my love and trust for financial gain. I took out my phone and photographed every page of every email in the folder. I made sure the images were clear and that the dates and email addresses were visible. Then, I went through the rest of the box, looking for anything else that might be useful. I found a few more emails, discussing the plan, including one where my mother expressed brief hesitation before ultimately agreeing that it was the best solution for everyone. I had been in the house for about 40 minutes. I knew I needed to leave soon, but I decided to check one more box, the one labeled legal documents. Inside, I found copies of various papers related to the estate, and then I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a draft of the document I had signed, but this version was dated 2 months before the argument in the living room. It had notes in the margins in my father's handwriting, discussing specific wording choices and legal implications. This proved that the document had been prepared long before that day. They had created it, refined it, and then engineered the entire situation to pressure me into signing it. The spontaneity of that afternoon, the sense that they were presenting a solution they had just thought of. It had all been theater. Every word, every gesture, every expression of concern had been rehearsed. I photographed these documents as well. Then I carefully put everything back exactly as I had found it. I made sure the boxes were in the same positions on the shelves, that nothing looked disturbed. I went back upstairs, locked the door behind me, and walked quickly back to my car. My whole body was shaking, but I had done it. I had the evidence. That afternoon, I sent all the photographs to my lawyer. She called me back within an hour, and I could hear the excitement in her voice. This changed everything, she said. This was clear evidence of fraud and conspiracy. With these documents, we had a real case. She cautioned that it would still be a fight, that my family would likely deny everything and claim the documents were taken out of context. But we had something solid now, something that could not be easily dismissed. She said she would file a motion to set aside the document I had signed, arguing that it had been obtained through fraud and undue influence. She would request a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding the signing. She warned me that this would get ugly. My family would be forced to respond, and they would not go down without a fight. Daniel, in particular, stood to lose a great deal if the document was invalidated. He would fight hard to protect his interests. I told her I understood. I was ready for the fight. I had spent 6 months being angry and hurt, and now I had a chance to actually do something about it. I was not guaranteed to win, but at least I had a chance. At least I was not going to let them get away with what they had done without any consequences. The lawyer filed the motion the following week. Within days, my parents and Daniel received notification that I was challenging the document. The responses came swiftly. My father called me for the first time in 6 months. His voice was cold and furious. He demanded to know how I had gotten those documents. I told him that did not matter. What mattered was what the documents revealed. He started to argue, but I cut him off. I told him that everything was in the hands of lawyers now, and that he should direct any further communication through legal channels. Then I hung up. Daniel sent me a series of text messages, each one more aggressive than the last. He accused me of being vindictive and greedy. He said I was tearing the family apart over money. He claimed that the emails were being misinterpreted, that they had just been discussing options, and I was blowing everything out of proportion. I did not respond to any of his messages. There was nothing to say. The evidence spoke for itself. My mother sent me a letter. It arrived in my mailbox 3 days after the motion was filed. In it, she wrote about how disappointed she was in me. She said that she had raised me to be better than this, to value family over material things. She claimed that I was destroying our family for the sake of greed, that I was showing my true colors. She ended the letter by saying that if I continued down this path, I would lose whatever chance I might have had at reconciliation, that I would be alone forever, with no family to turn to. I read the letter twice, then put it in a folder with all the other evidence. Her words stung, but they also strengthened my resolve. She was trying to manipulate me again, trying to use guilt and fear to make me back down, but I could see through it now. I understood how they operated, and I was not going to fall for it again. The legal process moved slowly. There were depositions and document requests and motions and counter-motions. My lawyer explained each step to me, preparing me for what to expect. Daniel hired an expensive attorney who argued that the emails were simply private family discussions and did not constitute fraud. He claimed that I had signed the document willingly and that I was now experiencing regret and trying to undo my own decision. But our evidence was strong. The timeline alone was damaging. The fact that the document had been prepared months before the supposed spontaneous family meeting. The fact that Daniel had explicitly written about exploiting my trust and my desire for family harmony. The fact that they had deliberately created conflict in order to pressure me into signing. All of this painted a clear picture of fraud. During my father's deposition, he was evasive and defensive. He claimed he did not remember the specific details of the emails. He said that the document had been prepared in advance simply to save time, not because they were planning to trick me. He insisted that I had been given every opportunity to read what I was signing, and that it was my own fault if I had not done so carefully. During Daniel's deposition, he was more aggressive. He argued that I had always been jealous of his success, that I resented him for doing well in life while I struggled. He claimed that I was fabricating a conspiracy theory to justify my own failures. His lawyer tried to paint me as bitter and vindictive, someone who could not accept responsibility for her own poor choices. But then my lawyer introduced the emails. She read them aloud, slowly and clearly, emphasizing the key passages where Daniel discussed exploiting my trust and using my personality traits against me. She asked him to explain what he meant when he wrote that I trusted them too much and that trust could be exploited. Daniel stumbled over his words, trying to backtrack, claiming it was just a figure of speech. But the damage was done. The words were there in black and white, and no amount of spin could erase them. The judge assigned to our case reviewed all the evidence and scheduled a hearing. My lawyer was cautiously optimistic. She said we had a strong case, but that judges were often reluctant to overturn signed documents unless the fraud was absolutely clear. She prepared me for the possibility that we might win or lose, and that either outcome would have to be accepted. The night before the hearing, I could not sleep. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. I thought about the little girl who had learned to be easy and accommodating, the teenager who had sacrificed her dreams for practicality, the young woman who had tried so hard to earn love through selflessness, the 40-year-old woman who had finally been betrayed one time too many. Tomorrow, a judge would decide whether I had been wronged or whether I was simply a regretful signer trying to undo my own decision. Tomorrow, my family would sit across from me in a courtroom, and we would air all our dysfunction in front of strangers. Tomorrow, I would either get a chance at justice, or I would have to accept that they had won completely. But regardless of the outcome, I knew that I had already achieved something important. I had fought back. I had refused to simply accept their version of events. I had found my voice and used it, and whatever happened tomorrow, they would know that I was not the pushover they thought I was. They would know that there were consequences for treating people the way they had treated me. As dawn began to break, I finally drifted into a restless sleep. My last thought before unconsciousness took over was a strange mixture of fear and hope. Fear of what the day would bring, but hope that maybe, just maybe, the truth would matter, that maybe justice was not just an abstract concept, but something that could actually happen, even to someone like me. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined. I had seen countless legal dramas on television, with their grand spaces and dramatic lighting, but this was just a modest room with fluorescent lights and worn carpet. My lawyer sat beside me at one table, while Daniel and my parents sat with their attorney at another. We did not look at each other. The silence between us was thick and suffocating. The judge entered, an older woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and reading glasses perched on her nose. She reviewed the documents in front of her for what felt like an eternity, before finally looking up and asking my lawyer to present our case. My lawyer stood and delivered a clear and methodical explanation of what had happened. She walked the judge through the timeline, starting with Daniel's first emails 9 months before I signed the document. She showed how the conflict had been manufactured, how the pressure had been applied systematically, and how the document had been presented as a spontaneous solution when in fact it had been prepared months in advance. She read excerpts from Daniel's emails, letting his own words condemn him. Then she called me to testify. I had practiced this moment with my lawyer dozens of times, but actually sitting in that witness chair, with my family staring at me from across the room, was terrifying. My voice shook as I described that afternoon in my parents' living room. I explained how exhausted I had been, how desperately I had wanted the conflict to end, how much I had trusted my parents to protect my interests. Daniel's lawyer cross-examined me aggressively. He tried to paint me as someone who had made a bad decision and was now looking for someone else to blame. He asked why I had not read the document more carefully. He asked why I had not hired my own attorney to review it before signing. He asked if I had been threatened or physically coerced in any way. The answer to that last question was no. And he seized on that, arguing that I had signed of my own free will. But my lawyer was ready for this. On redirect, she asked me to explain the emotional state I had been in. I described the weeks of arguments, the constant pressure, the way my mother had pleaded with me to just sign and end the conflict. I explained how I had been conditioned my entire life to be the accommodating one, the peacemaker, and how they had exploited that conditioning. I looked directly at the judge and said that I had trusted my parents to protect me, and they had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. Next came the depositions. The judge reviewed the transcripts carefully, paying particular attention to Daniel's testimony. My lawyer highlighted the sections where he had struggled to explain his emails, where his story had not quite held together. She pointed out the inconsistencies and the evasions. Then Daniel took the stand. He was confident, almost cocky. He testified that the emails had been taken out of context, that they were just him thinking through different scenarios with our father. He claimed that there had been no conspiracy, just a family trying to resolve a difficult situation. He said that I had always been jealous of his success, and that this lawsuit was really about resentment, not fraud. My lawyer's cross-examination was surgical. She asked him to explain specific phrases from his emails. When he tried to deflect or minimize, she pressed him. She asked him what he meant when he wrote that my trust could be exploited. He claimed it was poor word choice, that he had not meant it the way it sounded. She asked him why the document had been prepared 2 months before the family meeting if it was supposed to be a spontaneous solution. He stammered that they had just been preparing options in advance. Then she asked the question that changed everything. She asked him if he believed, at the time he wrote those emails, that I fully understood I was giving up my entire inheritance. There was a long pause. Daniel looked at his lawyer, who could not help him. He looked at my parents, who sat frozen in their seats. Finally, he said that he thought I probably understood, but that it was my responsibility to read what I was signing. My lawyer pounced on that answer. She pointed out that he had not said he knew I understood, only that he thought I probably understood. She suggested that he had deliberately kept the true nature of the document vague, that he had relied on my trust and exhaustion to prevent me from reading it carefully. She suggested that this was exactly the exploitation he had written about in his emails, Daniel's face turned red, and he started to argue. But the judge cut him off. The hearing lasted most of the day. By the time both sides had finished presenting their arguments, everyone in the room looked exhausted. The judge announced that she would take everything under advisement and issue a ruling within 2 weeks. She thanked everyone for their time and dismissed us. As I left the courtroom, I felt Daniel's eyes on me. I turned and met his gaze for the first time that day. There was hatred there, but also something else. Fear. He knew the hearing had not gone well for him. He knew that his own words had damaged his case. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I saw him look uncertain. My parents left without speaking to me, or even looking in my direction. My mother's face was pale and drawn. My father walked, stiffly, like he had aged 10 years in a single day. I felt a pang of something, not quite pity, but a kind of sad recognition of what we had all lost. We had been a family once, however imperfect. Now we were just adversaries in a legal battle. The 2 weeks of waiting were agonizing. I tried to focus on work, on my routine, on anything that would distract me from constantly checking my phone for news from my lawyer. I swung between hope and despair, sometimes within the same hour. I replayed the hearing in my mind, analyzing every word, every expression, trying to predict what the judge would decide. My friends tried to support me, but they could not really understand what I was going through. They had not been there in the courtroom. They had not seen the coldness in my parents' eyes or the smugness in Daniel's expression. They offered generic encouragement, but I felt fundamentally alone in this fight. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, my lawyer called. The judge had issued her ruling. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My lawyer spoke slowly, carefully. The judge had found that while the evidence suggested troubling behavior by my family, it did not rise to the legal standard of fraud necessary to invalidate a signed document. The emails, while disturbing now, were considered private family communications and did not constitute actionable fraud. The fact that I had signed voluntarily, without physical coercion or threats, weighed heavily in her decision. The document would stand. I had lost. I do not remember exactly what I said to my lawyer after that. Something about thanking her for trying, about understanding that she had done her best. She was kind and sympathetic, saying that the ruling was disappointing but not entirely surprising. Judges were conservative about overturning signed documents. She offered to discuss appeal options, but I could hear in her voice that she did not think an appeal would succeed. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment in complete silence. I felt numb. All the fight, all the anger, all the hope that had sustained me through the past months just drained away. I had gambled. Everything on this legal battle, and I had lost. My family had won. Daniel would keep the inheritance. My parents would face no consequences, and I would have nothing. The numbness lasted for days. I went through the motions of living, going to work, eating when I remembered to eat, sleeping fitfully. My coworkers noticed something was wrong but did not press me for details. I must have looked like someone in mourning, and in a way, I was mourning the death of justice, the death of the naive belief that good people win in the end. But then, slowly, something shifted. It started with a conversation at work. My boss, a woman named Helen who had always been supportive of me, called me into her office. She had noticed my distraction and wanted to check in. I had not told anyone at work about the lawsuit, but sitting in her office, looking at her genuinely, concerned face, I found myself telling her everything. Helen listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I was not expecting. She said that losing a legal battle did not mean I had lost everything. She said that my family had taken money from me, but they could not take my competence, my intelligence, or my future unless I let them. She said that the best thing I could do now was to build a life so successful that their betrayal would become irrelevant. It was similar to what the first lawyer had told me months ago, but hearing it now, after the loss, it hit differently. I realized that I had been so focused on the legal fight that I had put the rest of my life on hold. I had been waiting for justice to be delivered by a judge before I could move forward, but justice was not coming from the courts. If I wanted any kind of victory, I would have to create it myself. I started working harder than I ever had before. I took on additional projects at work, volunteered for the difficult assignments that others avoided. I was at my desk early and stayed late. I immersed myself in learning everything I could about digital marketing, taking online courses, attending seminars, reading industry publications voraciously. Within 3 months, I had become indispensable at the agency. Helen promoted me to Director of Client Services, a significant jump in both responsibility and salary. For the first time in years, I was making good money. Not wealth like Daniel had, but enough to be comfortable, to start saving, to think about a real future. I also started investing in myself in other ways. I joined a gym and started working out regularly, not to look a certain way, but to feel strong. I took up painting again, the hobby I had abandoned decades ago when my father told me to be practical. I started saying yes to social invitations, building a circle of friends who knew nothing about my family drama and liked me simply for who I was. Months passed. I heard nothing from my family, and I did not reach out to them. As far as I knew, they had moved on with their lives, confident in their victory. Daniel was probably enjoying the inheritance he had schemed to secure. My parents were probably relieved that the legal mess was behind them. They had won, and I had lost, and that was supposed to be the end of the story. But then something unexpected happened. A former colleague from years ago reached out to me on social media. Her name was Lisa, and we had worked together at the marketing firm before it downsized. She had seen my recent posts about my promotion and my work at the new agency, and she was impressed. She told me that she was now a partner at a boutique consulting firm that specialized in helping small businesses with their marketing strategies. They were looking to expand their team, and she thought I would be perfect for a senior consultant position. The job she described was exactly the kind of opportunity I had dreamed about. It would mean working directly with business owners, developing comprehensive strategies, having real creative input. It would also mean a significant salary increase and profit sharing. It was the kind of position that Daniel, with all his connections and advantages, would have pursued, and now it was being offered to me. I met with Lisa and her partners. The interview went exceptionally well. They were impressed with my experience and my ideas. Within a week, they made me an offer. It was generous, more than I had thought possible for someone with my background. I accepted immediately. My life changed rapidly after that. The consulting work was challenging but deeply satisfying. I was good at it, better than I had known. Clients responded to my strategies, and their businesses grew. I started building a reputation in the local business community. I was invited to speak on panels and at networking events. People started coming to me for advice. I bought a small house. Nothing extravagant, but it was mine. I furnished it carefully, choosing pieces that reflected my taste rather than trying to impress anyone. I hung my own paintings on the walls. I created a home that felt like a sanctuary, a place that was entirely my own. And through all of this, I never contacted my family. I did not send them updates or try to make them see what I had accomplished. I did not need their validation anymore. Their opinion of me, which had once been the center of my universe, had become irrelevant. I was building a life that had nothing to do with them, and that life was good. What I did not know, what I could not have known, was that my silence and my success were having an effect, that while I was moving forward and building something real, my family's situation was beginning to unravel, that the inheritance they had fought so hard to secure was not bringing them the happiness and security they had expected, that karma, which I had stopped believing in, was quietly preparing to show them that actions have consequences, but all of that was still to come. For now, I was simply living, working hard, building relationships, discovering who I was when I was not defined by my family's expectations or disappointments. I was 41 years old, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Almost a year had passed since the court ruling. I was now 42, and my life had transformed in ways I never imagined possible. The consulting firm where I worked had made me a junior partner, recognizing the substantial revenue I was bringing in. My client list had grown to include some of the most promising small businesses in the region. I had even been featured in a local business magazine article about successful women entrepreneurs in consulting. My house had become a true home. I hosted dinner parties with friends who genuinely cared about me. I had started dating again. Nothing serious yet, but I was open to the possibility of love in a way I had not been since my separation from Thomas. I woke up each morning with purpose and went to bed. Each night with satisfaction. The bitterness that had consumed me after the trial had faded into something quieter, a distant memory of pain that no longer controlled my present. Then, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, I received an unexpected phone call. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was hesitant, apologetic. It was Rebecca, Daniel's wife. She asked if we could meet for coffee. Her tone was strange, strained in a way that immediately put me on alert. I had not spoken to Rebecca since before the inheritance debacle. We had never been close, but she had always been polite to me at family gatherings. I was curious about what could have prompted this call after so much time and silence. We met at a quiet cafe downtown. Rebecca looked different than I remembered. Thinner, more tired, with worry lines etched around her eyes. She ordered coffee but barely touched it, her hands fidgeting with the cup. Finally, she spoke. She told me that things had fallen apart. Everything that had seemed so perfect, so secure, had crumbled. It started about 6 months after the trial ended. Daniel had made a series of bad business investments, convinced that the inheritance he had secured would allow him to take bigger risks. He had borrowed heavily, against the assets he expected to receive, using them as collateral for ventures that promised huge returns. But those ventures had failed spectacularly. One was a real estate development that collapsed when the market shifted. Another was a tech startup that burned through cash and produced nothing viable. Daniel had been so confident, so sure of his business acumen, that he had not properly vetted any of these opportunities. He had simply assumed that his success would continue indefinitely. The debts piled up quickly. Daniel started pressuring my parents to give him more money from the estate, arguing that he needed liquidity to cover his obligations. But they were running into their own problems. My father had made some questionable financial decisions in his retirement, and their savings were not as substantial as everyone had believed. The estate that Daniel had fought so hard to claim entirely for himself was worth significantly less than anticipated. Rebecca's voice cracked as she continued. The bank had foreclosed on their house, the beautiful property in the gated community. They had been forced to move into a small rental apartment. Daniel's expensive cars had been repossessed. The glamorous lifestyle that had been funded by expectation and credit had vanished almost overnight. But it got worse. My parents, facing their own financial difficulties and angry about Daniel's failed investments, had started to turn on him. They blamed him for pressuring them into the scheme to get me to sign away my inheritance. They claimed that it had been his idea, his plan, and that they had simply gone along with it to support him. Now they were saying that the whole thing had been a mistake, that they had destroyed their relationship with their daughter for Daniel's benefit, and he had squandered everything. Rebecca told me that my mother, in particular, had become bitter and resentful. She had started making comments about how maybe they should have treated both children fairly, how maybe greed had poisoned their judgment. My father, dealing with health issues that came with age and stress, had withdrawn emotionally. The family was fractured, with everyone blaming everyone else for the disaster their lives had become. I listened to all of this with a strange sense of detachment. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, to take satisfaction in their downfall, but mostly I just felt sad. Sad for the waste of it all, for the relationships destroyed, for the family that could have been but never was. Rebecca looked at me with tears in her eyes. She said she knew she had no right to ask me for anything, but she wanted me to know that she was sorry. She had known what Daniel was planning, and she had not stopped him. She had been complicit in the betrayal because she too had wanted the financial security. But now she saw what that greed had cost everyone, including herself. She told me that she was leaving Daniel, that she could not stay with someone who had treated his own sister so cruelly, and who had destroyed his family for money that turned out to be far less than he imagined. She said she was filing for separation and moving back to her parents' home. She wanted me to know that not everyone in the family thought what had been done to me was right. After Rebecca left, I sat in the cafe for a long time, processing everything she had told me. The irony was almost overwhelming. Daniel had schemed and manipulated to secure an inheritance that he thought would make him rich. But in his arrogance and greed, he had made terrible decisions that cost him everything. The very assets he had stolen from me had become his downfall. My parents, who had chosen favoritism and manipulation over fairness and love, were now reaping the consequences. They had their golden child, but he had disappointed them spectacularly. They had discarded their daughter, and now they were realizing what they had lost. But it was too late. The bridges had been burned completely. I thought about reaching out to them. Part of me wondered if this was the moment when they might apologize, when they might finally acknowledge the wrong they had done. But I knew better. People like my parents and Daniel did not apologize. They would rationalize and make excuses and blame circumstances. They would never truly take responsibility for their actions. More importantly, realized I did not need their apology. I had spent so much of my life seeking their approval, their validation, their love. But I had built a life without those things, and it was a good life. Their downfall did not make me happy, but it also did not change anything for me. I had already moved on. That evening, I sat in my home office and looked at the financial statements from my consulting firm. I was making more money now than I ever had. I had savings, investments, security. I had built this through my own effort, my own intelligence, my own determination. Nobody had given it to me. Nobody could take it away. I thought about the woman I had been a year and a half ago, sitting in my parents' living room, signing away my future because I was too tired and too trusting to protect myself. That woman felt like a stranger now. I had been broken and rebuilt, and the rebuilt version was stronger than the original had ever been. Over the following weeks, I heard more details through mutual acquaintances. Daniel had tried to start over but found that his reputation in business circles had been damaged. People had heard about his failed investments and his financial troubles. Nobody wanted to back his ventures or partner with him. He had fallen from grace spectacularly. My parents had sold their house, in the house where I had grown up, and moved into a modest retirement community. They lived on Social Security and what little remained of their savings. The comfortable retirement they had planned had evaporated. I heard through someone who attended their church that they looked aged and diminished, shadows of their former selves. I felt no satisfaction in their suffering, but I also felt no obligation to help them. They had made their choices, and those choices had consequences. I had offered them my love, my loyalty, my trust, and they had used those things against me. Now they would live with the results of their actions, just as I had lived with the results of mine. My life continued to flourish. I was invited to speak at a regional conference about strategic marketing for small businesses. The presentation went so well that I received multiple inquiries about private consulting. I was building something that went beyond just making money. I was building a reputation, a legacy of my own making. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. The return address was my parents' home, or rather, their former home. It had been forwarded from there to their new address and then to me. I almost threw it away without opening it, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a brief note from my mother. Her handwriting, usually so neat and controlled, was shaky and uncertain. She wrote that she had been thinking about me, that she wondered how I was doing. She said that she and my father were going through difficult times. She did not explicitly ask for help, but the implication was clear. She wanted me to know they were struggling, perhaps hoping I would reach out, perhaps hoping I would offer assistance. I read the letter, twice, then folded it carefully and put it in a drawer. I did not respond. There was nothing to say. They had taught me a valuable lesson about trust and family, though not the lesson they intended. They had shown me that blood relation meant nothing without respect and genuine love. They had shown me that I was stronger than I ever knew. Months turned into a year. My 43rd birthday came and went, celebrated with friends who had become my chosen family. I received a significant bonus from the consulting firm and used part of it to take a solo trip to Italy, something I had always wanted to do, but never felt I could afford or justify. I spent 2 weeks exploring cities, eating incredible food, visiting museums, and feeling completely free. On the last night of my trip, sitting at a small restaurant overlooking the Mediterranean, I realized something profound. I had won, not in the courtroom, not in the legal sense, but in every way that actually mattered. I had taken the worst betrayal of my life and used it as fuel to build something beautiful. I had transformed pain into power, loss into growth. Daniel had his scheme and his inheritance, but he had squandered it all and destroyed his family in the process. My parents had their favoritism and their manipulations, but they had ended up alone and diminished. And I, the one they had discarded and betrayed, had built a life of genuine success and happiness. The inheritance they stole from me turned out to be worthless compared to what I had gained. I had learned who I really was when stripped of family expectations. I had discovered my own strength, my own worth, my own capacity for resilience. I had learned that the best revenge truly was living well, not because it hurt them, but because it freed me. As I flew home from Italy, I thought about that afternoon in my parents' living room, the moment I signed away my inheritance. At the time, it had felt like the end of everything, but it had actually been the beginning of my real life, the life where I was defined by my own choices rather than their expectations. I never heard from my family again after my mother's letter. I assumed they eventually understood that I was not going to rescue them from the consequences of their actions. I hoped, in some small way, that they learned something from the experience, though I suspected they probably did not. Some people never learn, but I learned. I learned that family is not always about blood. I learned that trust, once broken so completely, can never be repaired. I learned that justice does not always come from courtrooms, but sometimes from simply living your life so well that those who wronged you become irrelevant. I am 43 years old now. I own my own home. I have a career I am proud of. I have friends who value me. I have a future that I am building on my own terms. And I have peace, the kind of peace that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you are worth. My family took my inheritance, but they could not take this. They could not take my strength, my intelligence, my capacity for joy. They could not take my future, and in the end, that is what mattered most. This is my story, not a story of revenge, but a story of survival and transformation, a story of finding out that sometimes losing everything is actually the beginning of gaining what you truly needed all along, a story of learning that the best victory is not defeating your enemies, but building a life so good that their betrayal becomes nothing more than a distant memory of who you used to be before you became who you were always meant to be.